For Crima Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Shomulikai, award-winning South African investigative journalist and television producer Graham Kotze joins me to unpack his book titled Zamazama. So how does the book balance the narrative of Zamazamas as desperate individuals trying to make ends meet with the reality of the heavily armed underground militias they form?
I think that's one of the core themes throughout the book is that, firstly, the world of Zamazamas is like dual to ours. It's almost like an underworld that happens right next door to where many people in South Africa live, but you don't see it. You don't often get to see it. So that's the one side of the duality. But the other side is within their own world. There are people who are certainly very violent, who are in control of these groups, who make millions from it, and who are absolutely ruthless. On the other end of it, they are using people often from backgrounds where there's a lot of poverty, there's joblessness, and they're exploiting those people. It's people who really just want to put food on their table, but are being used to go down into some of the worst working conditions in South Africa and make money for some really ruthless people.
And you describe an entire economy operating in pitch darkness. So, what did you find most surprising about the sophisticated underground towns that exist beneath South African cities?
From the very first time that I went into a shaft with Zamas, it's an incredible experience. It's a scary experience, but you just can't believe conditions down there. But I suppose most surprising to me is the length of time some people have to spend down there. So in a shaft that's relatively shallow, where they could easily ascend, they won't stay underground for very long. But when they go really deep, it's an incredible amount of energy you need to get back up to the surface. And that's when you find people living underground for months at a time. Some of them, when they reach the surface, they try and do so at night because coming out in the day, the sun is just too bright for them. On operational mines, what's incredible is you'll find there's a whole structure that smuggles food down to them, that smuggles cigarettes and liquor and water and SIM cards, you name it, whatever they may need down underground will be smuggled through to them, because on an operational mine, of course, you're dealing with all sorts of issues like security, etc., etc. Normal staff members, working for the legitimate mine. So these guys have to bypass that through very sophisticated smuggling networks. By the way, the people doing a lot of that, the moving of the goods underground, are often called quantums, after the taxis that we all see in South Africa. So the quantums move the food up and down, and that's a whole economy on its own within this broader illicit economy.
Many Zamazamas are undocumented migrants from neighboring countries such as Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. So, how does the book explain their willingness to trade extreme above ground poverty for life threatening conditions below?
I don't know. I do know that many of those people, South Africa's history with mining is very complex. It's been around for 100 plus years. And in that time, many of those mines employed migrant workers. So it was a migrant labor system where they were, again, also exploiting people, putting them in absolute horrible conditions, especially in sort of the beginning years of mining in South Africa. And many of those people stayed on. Many of them became workers here and skilled workers. When a lot of our mines closed, where did they expect them to go? So it's a problem that we have to deal with. Having said that, I must also say that it's certainly not only migrant laborers or undocumented foreigners. You do often find them. You do find them in large amounts. But having said that, many of the people making the most money are locals, are South Africans. So it's a mixed batch.
And why is it so difficult for units such as the Hawks to arrest and prosecute the syndicate bosses who profit the most?
That's a big problem. Unfortunately, the Hawks, as we know at the moment, I believe the latest stats is that they are at about 50% capacity. So in other words, they are only at 50% of their staff. They simply don't have the resources, the skill sets needed anymore. And there are a lot of commentators who say that the unit has been broken down for political reasons, that they've been just stripped of all the capacity. So that's one of the issues. The Hawks, I've dealt with the Hawks in a previous book. I've worked with them closely before. One of the main issues is the people who want to get the job done within the Hawks simply don't have the basic capacity or support that they would need. Secondly, I must say we have seen some really large cases prosecuted, very big operators taken down. The problem is, it's one of those, I mean, it's such a huge economy. There's so much money at stake. As soon as you see one big syndicate leader taken out of the system, it's simply a vacuum that gets filled immediately again. And then they have to sort of redo the process. So as soon as you take down one large boss, there's another one to follow.
And while we are still on that, you uncovered a deep state corruption, including instances where weapons used in underground turf wars were registered with the South African Police Services. So how central is institutional corruption to the survival of these syndicates?
I think it's in organized crime in general cannot exist without corruption. The two go hand in hand. It's from illicit gold to illicit tobacco to you name it, cash in transit heists, wherever you find properly organized crime. So in other words, large groups of individuals who make a living from doing crime. That is their only goal in life. And they are committing those crimes simply for profit and for greed. They have to corrupt people along the way. They need that insider info somewhere along the line. So on the mines, you'll find that they corrupt security personnel, they corrupt staff. That's how they are allowed inside the mines. That's how they get down the working mines. Often out in the field and the abandoned sites, we've been told that certain groups are paying police for protection. Certain groups are paying police vehicles to drive them around, to drive the gold around. So yes, it's deeply entrenched.
And do you think the current criminalization and policing strategies should be replaced with more holistic approaches?
I think it's going to be such a difficult one, but obviously, as things are going now, it's not working. We've seen Operation Vala Mgodi, which was the national effort by the SANDF and the police banded together to tackle illicit mining. They did address many areas. As soon as they left, we saw it all flare up again. Currently, there's Operation Prosper, where again, President Ramaphosa has allowed the SANDF to join SAPS in fighting, amongst other things, illicit mining. And it's simply not working. We all know it's not working. The problem seems to have gotten quite out of hand, in fact. And I think it's a very difficult thing to police right now. So a different approach, definitely. Could we formalize the industry? I'm not sure it's possible. Unfortunately, the levels of danger involved in working gold mines in South Africa are just so high that I can't see how government could allow people to do it. That's why it's illegal for me and you to go do it. It's simply too dangerous to go underground with very basic tools and try and reach gold. We have some of the deepest gold mines in the world. So that's, I think, one of the big problems with sort of formalizing artisanal mining.
The book links South Africa's illegal gold trade to international money laundering and terrorism financing. So which international sanctions could be triggered by these specific links?
The problem with international sanctions is that a lot of the gold leaving the country is legitimized before it does. That's the sort of the key recipe in gold. That's a big part of why there's such a huge market for gold and for illicit gold. So before the syndicates smuggle it out, it's most often just simply legitimized. And they'll use various strategies of doing that. They'll own old mining dumps and say the gold that they've actually bought from Zama Zamas is coming from the mining dump that they are re-mining now, etc., etc. And then in that way, they've legitimized that gold. It's sold on, it's exported very legally, and it's sent to markets all over the world, including places like Dubai and Switzerland. Tons of our gold goes there. And it's arriving there as legitimate gold.
And lastly, Graham, what are you hoping readers take away after reading your book?
It's many years of stories that I've covered in illegal mining. And I wanted people to see what that was like behind the scenes. So on the one hand, you're going into this world, you're going to see and hear about exactly how it works on all the levels, from the lowest of the low to the very highest of the high. But on the other hand, it was that experience what you never saw in the stories we told on television. How we got access, how we got behind the scenes, incredible characters that we met, people in the underworld and people in law enforcement, and just such interesting stories that I wanted to show people that side of the world. And I think to me, that's the book. The book is about illicit mining, certainly. It's going to take you deeper than most would. But the main aim was to sort of give you a behind the scenes look at how we did it.
That was Graham Coetzee unpacking his book, Zama Zama. Visit the Polity website to access more author interviews, news, and information updates. If you haven't already, subscribe to Polity's email services, including our new monthly Polity Bookshelf email, to stay informed about the latest news and Polity Bookshelf developments.